evening book talk. My name is Stephen McLeod, and I'm the Director of Library Programs here at the Washington Library. And it's my great pleasure to welcome this big crowd tonight. Before we get started, I want to give you a heads up on a few things that we've got coming up on our calendar. On November 21, we're hosting a free brown bag lunch discussing George Washington's interest in maps, particularly DeBar's The Atlantic Neptune from 1777. And that's going to be with Dr. Alexander Montgomery, who is Mount Vernon's manager for our Center for Digital History. Our next lunch at the library is going to be on December 9th, and that will feature historian Eli Merritt, who will discuss his new book, Disunion Among Ourselves, The Perilous Politics of the American Revolution. And our next Ford Evening Book Talk is going to take place on November 13. That's featuring Nathan Pearl Rosenthal, who's author of a new book, The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It. And now it's before I introduce our speakers, I also want to welcome this group of 40 gifted and talented students and their chaperones who are here from Henry Clay High School in Lexington, Kentucky. We're so thrilled that you're here with us tonight. And now to introduce tonight's guest speakers. David Head is a historian, author, and lecturer of history at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. He's also a distinguished faculty fellow in history at Kentucky Wesleyan College in Owensboro. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Buffalo, the State University of New York. He is the author of A Crisis of Peace, George Washington, the Newburgh Conspiracy, and the Fate of the American Revolution, which was a finalist for our 2020 George Washington Prize. He's also the author of Privateers of Americas, Spanish-American Privateering from the United States in the Early Republic, which won the Mystic Seaport Museum's 2016 John Gardner Maritime Research Award. Dr. Head was a member of our Washington Library's class 2015-2016 class of research fellows. Dr. Head is joined tonight by Timothy Hemmis, who is Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University, Central Texas, with a specialization in early American history. He received his PhD from the University of Southern Mississippi in 2015. Dr. Hemmis serves as the regional coordinator for the Society for Military History and is the history book review editor for the Presidential Studies Quarterly. His research focuses on empire, identity, war, and society in revolutionary America. His current book project, Trading Identities, National Identity, Loyalty, and Backcountry Merchants in Revolutionary America, 1740 to 1816, explores the identity of frontier merchants and how they navigated a revolutionary new world. His next project, tentatively titled Mapping the Republic, Early American Geographers and Surveyors and the Creation of the United States, 1775 to 1815, examines early American geographers and how their work helped define the American Republic. Dr. Head and Dr. Hemmis join us tonight to discuss their new book, seen here on the screen, A Republic of Scoundrels, the schemers, intriguers, and adventurers who created a new American nation. So please join me in a warm Mount Vernon welcome for Dr. David Head and Dr. Timothy Hemmis.
So thank you, Stephen, for that introduction. I am going to speak first. That's the plan for today. I'll talk a little bit about what a scoundrel was and who are some of the scoundrels that appear in the book. And then I'll turn things over to Tim, who will talk about one scoundrel in particular, Aaron Burr, and his activities in the West and his trial. And then I'll come back to say goodbye. No, I have a little bit of kind of a looking at it more broadly to summarize why there are so many scoundrels in the early republic. So that's the plan for today. Here we are. So first of all, let me talk about what a scoundrel was. Here is a good place to start with a definition. The dictionary of Samuel Johnson and his dictionary from 1755. He has another edition that is published in the 1770s. Okay. And at UCF, where I teach, they are engaged in a kind of long-term digital history project to digitize the 1755 version of the encyclopedia to sort of cross-reference all of the entries, pull up the images. It's going to be a really useful tool for researchers in the future. So if you like 18th century words, search for the dictionary, Johnson's Dictionary UCF, and the project will come up for you. Okay. I know you guys like 18th century words. I can just tell. Okay. So the 18th century word scoundrel. Here's Johnson's definition. A mean rascal, a low petty villain. Perfectly clear, right? Well, one of the fun things about studying history is understanding what each of those words means in context. Okay, so we can never quite assume that a word means what we think it means, that it means the same thing. That's actually one of the things that you develop as a historian, is a sense of when do I really need to look into what this word means and when can I just kind of keep reading? Because obviously you can't look up the meaning of every single word in every source you're going to find. You'll never get anywhere. So you develop a kind of source of, well, maybe this doesn't quite mean what I think. So if you look into all these definitions here, we see that the word mean means wanting dignity of low rank or birth. So not mean as cruel, okay? You're so mean, you won't let me go out tonight, okay? Right. Things you heard from your parents, things you say to your parents, right? In this context, it has the meaning of social status. So someone of low social status is mean, okay? A rascal. What would happen if you called a man a rascal in the 18th century? Yeah, the dueling motion there. Maybe not all the way there, but that would be a major insult to a man of honor because you're implying that the person is a mean fellow, someone of low social status. A scoundrel, okay, well, that's just referencing the other word. A sorry wretch. Okay, I like that one. Low, in this sense, means not elevated in rank or station, abject. So again, another social status word here. Can you tell that people in the 18th century really care about your social status? They have multiple words to describe it. Okay, so low is not elevated in rank or station or abject. And petty, that's closest to what we have. Small, inconsiderate, inferior, or little. And villain, a wicked wretch. What happens if someone calls you a villain? The same thing that happens if they call you a rascal. It's a different kind of wretch, but still one that is a major insult. Okay, so that is Dr. Johnson's meaning of a scoundrel. And you'll see here it's focusing in on social station, social rank as being a key part of it. Someone who's behaving like the lower sort are assumed to behave. In the American context, I think you get some indication of how the meaning changes over time by looking at another famous dictionary. This is the dictionary of Noah Webster. And he eventually lends his name to the Webster's Dictionary, and which is now kind of more of a IP kind of property. I don't know who bought that, what publisher owns that right now, but it did in fact originate with Noah Webster, the great American lexicographer, maker of dictionaries. His definition of a scoundrel is a mean, worthless fellow, a rascal, a low, petty villain. Wait a minute. Where did he get that from? With no citation either. Okay. Tell your teacher, but Noah Webster did it. Oh, I don't know if he's going to get away with that. So you see, they're copying the definition of another one. But what I really like here, and I want to draw your attention to, is the way that Webster has added a new element. He says, a man without honor or virtue. That's something that's really key to the American understanding of what a scoundrel is. Someone lacking in honor, someone lacking in virtue. Okay? Virtue in this sense means the willingness to sacrifice oneself and one's own goals to the good of the group, in this case, the good of the country. Okay? That's what virtue is supposed to be, kind of public virtue that public men, leaders, are supposed to display at this time. As an adjective, it's used to mean low, base, mean, or unprincipled. Okay? So you get some of the American shading of the word, and especially the idea of failing in virtue, that kind of public virtue that we see here. Okay. Who is a scoundrel? So in our book here, we are really talking about what the book is about is each chapter is a case study of a particular figure, how they acted like a scoundrel, okay, and what the significance of that is. Not everyone in the book is clear-cut as a scoundrel. Several of the chapters are about people who may have been wrongly considered a scoundrel. You may have gone back and forth in their actions because people are complicated. They're not all one thing or all the other thing. So for the book, we recruited different contributors, different authors who are specialists in all these characters to write about their scoundrel activity in the chapters. So some of the names will probably be familiar to you. There is Benedict Arnold, who was most famous for betraying Washington, plotting to turn over West Point to the British. There's James Wilkinson. Some people who are more familiar with the period may know the name James Wilkinson. He is the scoundrel who shows up the most in other scoundrels' lives. Everywhere we looked in the research, you could find him scheming something. James Wilkinson was the highest-ranking general in the American Army in the early Republic, and he was also on the payroll of Spain as a secret agent, passing information about America, who he was sworn to defend as the general, to a not enemy but a rival. Okay? I can't imagine how much trouble that would get you in today if you are caught passing information to the enemy. Even if you're a lower rank, you can get a lot of trouble for that, not to mention a general doing that kind of thing. But that was James Wilkinson, and that is only one of many schemes that he was involved in. Aaron Burr, who Tim will talk about, probably most famous today as the dueling partner of Alexander Hamilton. And by dueling partner, I mean the man who shot Hamilton. Supposedly afterwards, Burr would go around and would speak of Hamilton as my friend Hamilton, whom I shot. Okay. I pray that none of your friends shall ever refer to you that way. Okay. But there are many other scoundrels that we found lurking around in this period. So some of those scoundrels include people who you may not know as much about. There's William Blount. William Blount was the first territorial governor of Tennessee. He was a land baron who amassed just an enormous amount of land all throughout Tennessee. He was the first senator to be sent from Tennessee when it became a state. And I believe he was the first senator to be impeached. And I don't think he was removed from office, but he kind of, hightailed it out of there before they could do it to him. So that's William Blount. Okay, so an influential government figure who's also scheming to buy up as much land as he possibly could by means fair and foul. Philip Nolan is another figure who was well known at one point, but his memories kind of faded over time. He was a horse trader from Louisiana into Texas when Texas was a part of Spain. And you kind of go back and forth over the border, and Spanish authorities are always wondering, what is this guy doing? Is he really just trading for horses, or is he gathering information for the United States to prepare for a U.S. invasion? If they wanted to know, I guess they should have asked Wilkinson for the information on his activities, right? Can I give you a confession about how I, as a suburbanite middle-class person who's never really been to a farm except to pet the animals with my children? For the longest time, I thought that Philip Nolan was trading horses to race them. That's so dumb. He wanted the horses for the farm to work, right? Of course. I don't know where I got that from, but it did take me a while to realize that that's what's going on here. Okay. There's also Thomas Green, a figure in Georgia, who's, again, trying to push the borders between Georgia and Spanish territory and expand the United States and gain some territory, gain an advantage for himself. There's Matthew Lyon, who is a congressman from Vermont, who's famous. There's a famous picture of him fighting with another congressman. One has the tongs from the fireplace set, another has the poker, and they got into a brawl on the floor of the Congress. He was eventually imprisoned because of the Alien and Sedition Act. Then he was elected back to office anyway. Okay, see that. So yes, we finished. I finished my portion here with a congressman, the greatest scoundrel of them all, right? So that brings me to the end of my portion here. I'll invite Tim up to talk about one particular episode of Scoundrels in depth. Okay. Thank you.
Good evening. So I'll be talking about the American scoundrel, Burr, Aaron Burr. You probably, I don't know, one of my earliest memories is the Got Milk commercial. Some of you are probably too young to remember the Got Milk commercial. How many remember that one? All right. And this guy's eating a peanut butter sandwich, and he's got milk, and he runs out of milk, and there's a contest on the radio, and asks who shot Alexander Hamilton, and he calls in, and he gets on there, and he's got his mouth full of peanut butter, and he's trying to say Aaron Burr, and he can't say it. It's Aaron Burr, and he doesn't win. But that was one of those kind of things that kind of I was probably your age, and it caught my attention for history. I'll be honest with you. But trivia question: that was actually Michael Bay, the director who directed that. So, but now we all know Burr because of Hamilton. So, interestingly, I'm actually going to start off not talking about Aaron Burr, but I'm going to talk about a guy named Colonel George Morgan. Colonel George Morgan was a merchant in Philadelphia, and then he'll move out into Western Pennsylvania. And in about 2010, I was working on my dissertation, and I came across an image from 1927. This is not from 1927, of a monument to Colonel George Morgan. And one of the interesting things, this monument is in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, which is just south of Pittsburgh. It's tucked in a little working class neighborhood. You would never find it, unless you were really looking for it. It's in someone's backyard. And so I went out and, dedicated historian, went to go find it. And I found it. And what's interesting is really the end part that talks about how in this house, it's commemorating where George Morgan's house was. Matter of fact, these stones were actually built from the foundation. But it talks about how George Morgan denounced Aaron Burr's treasonous plot, and by telling President Thomas Jefferson. And that kind of stuck with me. Like, what is up with this? What's going on with this whole business? And so in some ways, that's kind of what launched this whole project in a way, many years ago. So, but here's a portrait of George Morgan. He was a merchant and also land speculator. During the American Revolution, he eventually rise to the rank of colonel in the Continental Army. Although he never had a combat duty, he was actually really just a diplomat and a commissionary, or a commissary. And he was also a diplomat. He worked with Native Americans around Fort Pitt and represented the Continental Congress. So he was very involved in the revolution on the frontier. Although he will get into a disagreement with his commanding general, and he'll go home to Philadelphia and leave Fort Pitt. And I will actually have several correspondence with George Washington explaining why he's not doing his duty. But he will retire and go back to civilian life as a merchant and land speculator. And then in 1788, he will go and, for a brief moment, will join the Spanish in the New Madrid colony. So Spain had controlled the west of the Mississippi, and they wanted to create a new colony, New Madrid, in present-day Missouri. And so George Morgan was recruited to do this. Now, on that surface, he would be a scoundrel himself. So this story has a lot of different scoundrelly people in it. But something changes in Morgan. So after 40 days in New Madrid, he goes home, and he's upset because the Spanish don't come through. And lo and behold, someone working behind the scenes is a guy named James Wilkinson, and working with the Spanish and telling him, don't listen to Morgan and so forth. And so Morgan goes home to Philadelphia. Eventually he'll retire on his Western Pennsylvania homestead named after himself called Morganza. I mean, one day I'll have a place I'll name after myself. And so it's there in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, and he'll be there in 1796. But where the story gets interesting is on August 24th, 1806, he gets a letter from a messenger saying that Aaron Burr, his old friend, Colonel Aaron Burr from the Revolution, is going to visit. He's also the former vice president. And you're going to open your house to them, right? And so he invites Burr and his mysterious compatriot with him to visit George Morgan at his house, and they will have dinner. And dinner is, full of those pleasantries and, trying to catch up with old friends. But after dinner, that's when things get really heated in the conversation. And the conversation turns to this idea of, what is Western Pennsylvania like? There's this east-west divide in this new country. And he goes on, and Morgan is talking about this. And this is George Morgan from the testimony that he will give in the trial against Aaron Burr. And he goes on, after dinner, I spoke to our fine country. He observed that when he went there first in the 1760s, that there was not a single family between the Allegheny Mountains and the Ohio. And that by and by, eventually they'll have Congress sitting in their very own neighborhood or even in Pittsburgh. And then they kept sporting over a glass of wine, as you do after dinner, not underage, but yeah. And so wine allowed the conversation to flow even more. And so it got to the point where Colonel Burr started arguing with Morgan about the division between the states. The eastern states, the Atlantic states, were totally divided from those western states, and there was two different people, and it was really this regionalism. Well, this conversation continued on, and I can let you read that, but there's a split between that east and west, and those western folks, and this was the argument that Burr is really kind of throwing out there, is that the West should not be tributaries to the Atlantic states, this east-west divide, and talking about taxes and demand. And it got to the point where they really started talking about maybe the West rising up, and Burr really pushing this, rising up against the government, talking about the weakness and imbecility of the federal government. And Burr was capturing on this moment. And it gets even further. There's accounts from John Morgan, who's the eldest son of George Morgan, who talks about this conversation. And they said at the dinner table that Burr started talking about how with 200 men, he could drive the president and Congress into the Potomac. And that with 400 or 500, he could take possession of the city of New York. And in response, this is one of the sons, we're not quite sure, there's conflicting reports here, but they said that he would be damned if they could take our little town of Canonsburg with such a force, which is, Canonsburg's a small little tiny, frontier town. And so they're really fighting over this, this concept of what's going on. Are there going to be a civil war? Think about it, 1807, right? But what Burr really was trying to do was recruit the West, encapsulate this regionalism that had occurred. A few years earlier, in 1794, you have the Whiskey Rebellion. And these were, the frontier farmers of Pennsylvania and Western Virginia, not West Virginia, rose up against the federal government over an excise tax on whiskey. And one of the ringleaders was David Bradford. And actually, Burr was trying to figure out and look for David Bradford because these are the types of people he wanted to recruit. Fortunately, I would say probably, is David Bradford, after the Whiskey Rebellion, left and went down to Baton Rouge. So he was no longer in the area. But this, because Burr was asking all these questions the next morning to John Morgan about David Bradford and others, that got, the back of your neck tingling. What's going on? And so John Morgan will come home and tell his dad, hey, no, you need to go alert your friend Thomas Jefferson. And that's what will happen. This is the letter that Thomas Jefferson writes back to George Morgan. Unfortunately, we don't have the letter that George Morgan wrote to Thomas Jefferson. I'm not sure where it went, but we do know that it was written because of the way Thomas Jefferson wrote back. And George Morgan will always claim that he'll be the first one to alert Thomas Jefferson about Aaron Burr and his treasonous plot. And so he will go on to alert the president. And the president had already been hearing other things and whispers about what Burr was doing on the frontier. It was in the newspapers and all sorts of stuff going on. And so Morgan will then also, I guess got animation going on here, will write to Militia General Presley Neville in Pennsylvania, and we'll talk about this plot, this infurious scheme against our country. And we'll talk about kind of what Burr is up to and really trying to get people to go and stop him. And so he's, sounding all the alarms. And other people are doing that as well. And remember, we told you that James Wilkinson will show up. Well, here he is. James Wilkinson will be recruited by Burr, and he'll go along with Burr for a little bit. And eventually, he will turn on Burr. And when I say by recruiting, Wilkinson was going to take the army and drive down to New Orleans and take New Orleans. And there was all these different plots going on. And James Wilkinson was outright recruited by Samuel Swartout, who was one of Burr's allies. He didn't actually meet with Burr, but Swartout did pass along a cipher letter. And this letter will then be sent to Thomas Jefferson as part of James Wilkinson's affidavit against Aaron Burr and his allies. And so this goes on. And so he writes on December 26, 1806, an affidavit explaining that he went along with Burr to pull out details and to spoil his schemes and so forth. And so he alerts Burr of his schemes. And in that, he also includes his letter. I'm throwing this out there. He was we know after he died that he became he was a Spanish spy. He was known as Agent 13, which will be a brilliant title for his biopic if anybody wants to make that movie. But Wilkinson probably turned on Burr to save his own skin, is what I would say. And because protect his status, protect his position in both the U.S. and the Spanish. But what was Burr's plots? There's a lot of, Burr was, in a lot of ways, he was very brilliant. And he didn't tell one person, he told one group one thing, and to another group, he told something different. And so his stories were always slightly different. And so this also made, nobody could track him down and really kind of pin him down. What are you doing? And so one of those was filibustering, which is today we think of filibustering in Congress, but it's really the unauthorized military expedition against Spanish territories held by Mexico. He also had a connection with Baron de Bastrop from the Netherlands, which there's actually Bastrop, Texas, named after him. And so there's, the idea of filibustering. There's talk of he was going to take over New Orleans and seize the banks and take the money from the banks to fund his filibustering, all sorts of different stuff going on. There was conversations about creating an independent Western state / republic with Aaron Burr at the head. Of course, right? And then there was, the conversation with the Morgans taking over Washington City with an army of frontiersmen. Well, any one of these things probably would have led to a civil war if they were allowed to come to fruition. But fortunately, that didn't happen. So here's the famous Burr always scheming towards the west. And in February of 1807, he'll be arrested in McIntosh, Alabama, which is just north of Mobile, Alabama. There's really not much there. I've been there a couple times, but it's quite interesting that he's on the run and he's recognized and he's arrested by a Lieutenant Edmund Gaines. And then he's brought to Fort Stoddard and held there. And then there's some weird stuff that goes on. There's a Spanish official that arrives trying to see Burr and all sorts of stuff. And eventually will then be taken across country all the way up to, he's supposed to go to Washington and to sit trial for treason. And he will actually, on the way, there will be a couple attempts there where he'll jump off and escape and all sorts of, it's just, it could be a movie in itself too. And so eventually Burr will make it into Virginia. They will eventually take it and have the trial will take place in Richmond. And this will be the trial of the century. And I know that's a term that is used all the time. But this one definitely was. The judge himself was John Marshall, the head of the Supreme Court. You also have Burr's dream team defense. Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General, Luther Martin, who's the Attorney General of Maryland, John Wickham, and don't forget Burr himself. Burr was a brilliantly trained lawyer himself. Matter of fact, he will actually cross-interrogate many of the witnesses, including George Morgan and his sons. And this trial will be an absolute circus. And one of the things that takes place, and I know it's a small one, and is the Feast of Treason. And it just kind of stands out as kind of, maybe it was just a happy accident, which it probably was, but Burr's lawyer, John Wickham, had a dinner party, invited John Marshall to it. Well, Burr was in attendance. By the way, John Marshall's wife told him not to come. But this gets pulled out into the press, and it gets labeled the Feast of Treason. The press will do its thing, right? So it's really kind of interesting, and this becomes, and it captures the nation. Now, what happens to Burr? Well, he's actually acquitted, but he's not really innocent at all. All the schemes that he was doing was actually there. And unfortunately, what happens is they try him for treason, and treason needs to have an overt, and this is John Marshall's definition, there needs to be an overt action. And Burr never actually had an overt action. Everything that he did was really a conspiracy. And so it was really hard to prove. And again, Burr himself and his dream team, literally ran circles around the prosecution. And so there were other charges still pending, including, the murder of Alexander Hamilton. So he went on a tour of Europe and then came back. So that's just one. And there's so many of these, like James Wilkinson, George Morgan, all these folks. There's a lot of scoundrels that are just involved in this one thing. And we could have, whole bunch of stuff going on. So the question is, and this is where David will pick up, is why were there so many scoundrels?
Hello again. That was a wonderful talk, wasn't it? So here I am to look at one more question to conclude our presentation today. We've alluded many times to the fact that there were numerous scoundrels, and we talked about one in depth, and I alluded to some of the others. And literally, we could have had 20 scoundrels in the book, but I had to restrain Tim. I told him, no publisher is going to give us 250,000 words. It's just not going to happen, so we got to restrain ourselves somehow. But why were there so many scoundrels in this period? What I think it comes down to is the experience of gaining independence, the unexpected fruits of independence. The United States became its own country. And the ideal of becoming their own country was that this was supposed to free Americans to govern themselves, to no longer be governed by England, to form their own governments in which the people had a say, especially a say in how their property was taxed. Because taking away someone's property in this period is seen as an assault on their freedom. So that's what they really want to have a say in, that kind of thing. So this is the government of our own making. We can make the rules that we're going to live by. And the idea was that Americans were going to live virtuously, because a republic in which people are governing themselves, none of that can hang together if the people are all out pursuing their own self-interest and not sacrificing on behalf of the greater good of the whole of the country. So that was the ideal, that the United States would be freed from the kind of corruption of monarchy, and then you could live virtuously and govern yourselves. That was the ideal. Of course, being free to govern yourself frees people to govern themselves. They do that not always virtuously, not always wisely. People get the chance to define what they mean or what they want their own goals to be. They get to define themselves in a way that was not necessarily wanted in the ideal of a republic of self-governing virtuous men. And some of these men are going to decide that no, it's not sacrificing on behalf of the country is what I want. What I want is to advance myself, advance my family, to become the kind of figure who establishes today we might think of it as generational wealth, right? That your children and grandchildren all the way down there are going to have something because of you. That they would have thought more, in addition, in terms of kind of a family name, not a title of nobility, but a name that you can look up to, that you're one of the Lees, for example, in this part of Virginia. So that's the kind of thing that people were thinking of. They could grab that for themselves. What scoundrels do is they take the freedom to pursue their own goals, and they define, right, the goal themselves. They don't play the kind of game that even just pays lip service to public virtue. So men were always ambitious for office in this period, but many of them felt they had some kind of obligation to at least pretend that they didn't want power. Okay? So you could talk privately, you could scheme all you wanted to get elected, but when you came and faced the people, faced the voters, you had to put on a pose of indifference. It's like, oh no, I can't possibly gain that office. You can't want me. There are all these other men who are more capable than I am. What's that? You insist? Well, if you insist, then it would be the greatest honor of my life to yield to your pleas, to acquiesce in taking this leadership role just for a small time. But may I borrow your power? Okay. That's the kind of game that you had to play. Washington, of course, exemplified this, that acknowledging the public suspicion of ambition very effectively. Of course, Washington is a very ambitious man, but he is able to signal all the time in all of his writings, especially when he's gaining a new office, when he's becoming president, saying that he is unworthy, undeserving of this honor. So he says it all the kind of time. And you think, well, why are you bad-mouthing yourself? You're such a poor-mouthing yourself. You know, you're good at this leadership stuff, right? George needs a pep talk. Okay? No, he's signaling to people that he can be trusted with power. You see the way that many of the scoundrels just ignore that virtue game in the way that they corrupt public office. William Blount is a great example of this. He's someone who uses his office as territorial governor for example, to negotiate treaties with Native Americans, grabbing as much land not just for the state of Tennessee, but for himself personally, that he can benefit from using force or just threats of force. All the time, he writes back to Washington, who's the president at that time, saying, oh, I got things handled, everything's going smoothly, everything's great. And he's grabbing all his land for himself. plotting against the United States with foreign powers, especially Spain. One of the major themes of our book that it wasn't our intention, but the way it kind of bubbled up through the sources and what the chapters ended up being about was the contest between the United States and Spain. It's easy to forget that for the first 40 years, the United States shares a border with Spain. And not just in Florida, right, which the United States gets Florida from Spain, but also all along the Mississippi. That's all Spanish Empire, and that's all a border with the United States must be going to become of U.S. That territory because of America's relationship with Spain is an open question. Finally, you see the way that individuals usurp U.S. sovereignty on the borders. Wilkinson is someone like this, Thomas Green, who I mentioned before. The borders are a critical zone because that's where the United States is going to collide with a foreign power, possibly drawing the United States into a war. But it's also the place that's furthest away from the center of power in Washington. And it's also the hardest to communicate with and the hardest to control. So the place that's hardest to control is also the place that's most likely to cause conflict. You can see how that plays out together. And for scoundrels, like, conflict means opportunity. That brings us to the end of our presentation here today. And I want to thank you again for coming out tonight. And we look forward very much to continuing our conversation with question and answer. Then we can talk to people afterwards as well. I do want, before we finish here, I do want to put up our contact information. So let's say that tonight you are drifting off to sleep and you bolt upright and say, that's what I always wanted to ask about James Wilkinson. You can roll back over and go back to sleep safe in the knowledge that you can contact us in the morning, but not too early because I'm not waking up at 6 o'clock. Okay. But yes, please, if you have anything that comes up in the future, please feel free to contact us. Thank you again for coming.
Do we have any questions?
I'd like to ask you a question about what was called libel per se or defamation per se. And back a couple hundred years ago, there were certain accusations like being accused of criminality or being accused of being an adulterer that were thought to be so damaging that it wasn't even necessary to prove that those accusations were damaging to their target in court. The very fact of the accusation was thought to be sufficiently damaging. And so we know that criminality and adultery were sufficient to be liable per se. I'm curious about the term scoundrel. If someone said that if someone accused someone else of being a scoundrel, do you think that would qualify as being sufficiently damaging to someone else's reputation to be defamatory under common law at around 1806?
Right. Have you seen anything on this, Tim? I think, well, I'll say that neither of us are lawyers.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you seen anything on that question?
I would say that it is more of a political agenda to call someone a scoundrel and get people on their side, but I don't think legally there's anything binding or anything like that. It's all about the court of public opinion, right? So.
Perfect. Is there a question on this side?
Hi. Can you explain where Andrew Jackson fits into all this?
Oh,
Yes.
so Andrew Jackson was recruited by Aaron Burr and then eventually will fade off. But I mentioned Samuel Swartout. Swartout will actually become one of Jackson's biggest supporters. And so there is actually a connection between this. There's a end of the chapter that I threw out there that maybe Burr is the first populist and kind of leading to the age of Jackson. So
I think the Swartout, this is the same guy who absconds with a bunch of money, government money. Yeah, so he runs off with a bunch of the government's money. Yeah. And I believe that to swart out, it becomes like a word, well, like a slang. Yeah. If you can see that as like an insult that someone might use. I don't know if it's actionable at common law, but that was a insult in the period after that supporter of Jackson and stole all the money. Yes.
How many scoundrels are in the book, and does it go in depth with each one?
We have 12?
Yeah, 12
Correct.
chapters.
12 chapters. And some of these, so there are, one chapter is about a trio of brothers, the Kemper brothers, Nathan, Samuel, and Reuben Kemper. And they were starting a rebellion in West Florida. West Florida is basically the panhandle of Florida today, and it was part of Spain at the time. It eventually becomes part of the United States. So they were trying to kind of stir up a rebellion against Spanish rule, mostly to serve their own interests because they're involved with a business dispute with a partnership that dissolved, and they didn't want to pay the partner what they owed him. And then the partner got the Spanish authorities to go collect the debt. And then they said, let's rebel against Spain instead, right? Come on, neighbors, you all hate Spain too. Right? Like, no, they didn't. They were happy. The Anglo-Americans, they're happy enough with Spain's authority. They didn't happen to have the Spanish authorities trying to get them to pay up on a debt that they owed. So that's, there's 3 in that chapter. So there are 12 chapters, about 12 to 15 scoundrels a piece, if you can group some of them together. But like I mentioned previously, we could have gone 20, 25 easily.
Very interesting discussion. I had some question about the motivation, and I want to tie it together with Benedict Arnold's invasion of Quebec. Apparently, Aaron Burr was on that excursion along with James Wilkinson. Is there any reason to suspect maybe the failed exploits in Quebec was motivation for these gentlemen to bear some sort of grudge, having endured what they had endured that winter in 1776?
I'm not sure I would draw a direct line to Quebec, because I think it's more about his embarrassment and connection with his feud with Hamilton, and then it spills out from that. I don't know if it goes back to that. I mean, the Revolution is a proving ground for all these, for the entire founding generation. And one part of this project was to show not just the founding fathers, but a more complete picture of the founding generation. So I don't know if it goes back to that. It's an interesting angle. It's not something I explored.
Yeah, I mean, I would think you got to remember that Aaron, these are very young men, right? I mean, Burr's like 19 when that's happening, 20, something like that. Wilkinson is the youngest general during that period. He's like 21 or something in the general, right? And it's just crazy. So yes, these are young men, and these events are 30 years later, right? So I think it's very difficult to draw a direct connection. They've had 30 years of life experience in other grudges that they can nurse instead, is probably the good way of putting it.
Did Burr's scheme with the West have anything to do with him eventually killing Hamilton, or were they like different situations?
The murder happened before, and so it was his way of escaping that and going. He went on a Western tour right after that. So, thank you.
I'm wondering, is your book all men, or are there any women?
So yes,
I want to add on to
okay,
that.
yes.
I'm writing a biography of Mrs. Benedict Arnold.
Okay.
And I've also written a biography of Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte. And I could name you like 5 other women who were behaving badly in this time period. So I'm with you. Like, why are men only scoundrels?
Right. So they are only they're only men in the book. Well, as they're not characters. It's not I mean, they are characters, but it's not like Star Wars characters or something. That's a hard point to get across to my students sometimes, that these are real people. I think the way that we approached it was these were people who had some kind of most of them are people with some kind of public office, and they are aspiring after, so supposedly they're falling short of that aspiration to be virtuous in a public way, right? So I think that women behaving badly, right, is, I don't know that you would say that's a scoundrel, right? I think that we have their own appellation applied to them. So that's where we were kind of, I think, putting that together, that these are men who have a public role and are falling short of that public role of self-sacrificing virtue.
Had Burr succeeded in his plans, how do you think that would have like affected America in like total? Like, would there have been a civil war? Do you think they would have been able to put it down, or like would there have been a separation?
It is a good what if question. I don't usually play the game of what if, but I do. I tell my students that, but I really think that there probably would be a civil war. There was contention. It was one of the most divided times. When you look at newspapers and all the stuff at that time, it was very contested, and so it possibly could have. And I put that up there on the slide, saying I think one of these schemes would have either launched us into a civil war or a war with Spain.
I was gonna, I'm gonna stay away from Burr. I've written about the Burr conspiracy. I was gonna instead talk about, ask you about how other people that we think of as far from being scoundrels could have looked like scoundrels at the time. I just read William Maclay's diary. He was a Pennsylvania senator in the first federal Congress. He was convinced that Alexander Hamilton was the greatest scoundrel of all because he was using his power over the Treasury to corrupt congressmen in order to get them to approve what he wanted them to approve. And he was convinced that Washington wasn't too far from a scoundrel for his involvement in that. So what do we do with that? That there were people on the exact opposite side of all of these who were seen by, I mean, Maclay's not a scoundrel himself. He's a pretty honest guy. He's just convinced he's an honest Republican and that they're not, that they're crypto-monarchists.
Yeah. I'm thinking it's going down to the partisan politics, right? Of using scoundrel as a political tool to label your opponents, right? And I think that's where it comes down to. I didn't get to talk about, why Morgan turns on Burr. Well, Morgan's a Jeffersonian. And he doesn't want it. He did not care for the Federalists. And then all of a sudden, Jefferson's in power. He likes his position. So I think a lot of it is partisan politics going into it. And so, yes, I think the scoundrel label gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah, so there are two chapters that talk about figures who may, doubtful whether they really deserve the label, right? Charles Lee, the general during the American Revolution, his greatest sin is that he doesn't fawn over Washington the way that some officers did, right? Washington provokes two responses. And among the majority of the officers, especially the young ones, they're like, oh, Washington's wonderful. And then some other ones are jealous of him, think, I could have done that too. Why is he always in the right place and gets lucky when it could be me? Lee is in the, it should have been me in charge and I would have won the how you could fill in your own words after that war. Another one is Matthew Lyon. Right? One of the things that Matthew Lyon's greatest offense is that he's not who the Federalists think should be a congressman. I mean, that's what a lot of it comes down to. He's an Irish immigrant. He's supported by the wrong kind of people. People would have been considered low and mean and all that kind of thing. So that is something that the book talks about, is the malleability of that scoundrel's label and how some people get that reputation perhaps undeservedly because of who their enemies are.
I'm curious about in this period, what type of power are the scoundrels most likely to exploit and use? Is it a monetary one, whether it's land or hard currency? Is it political? Is it social power? I know they're all trying to exploit at some point, but what's the common thread between them? Is it a combination, or which one would you say runs through them all most strongly?
Good question. I think it varies per scoundrel. Each individual has their own motivation. George Morgan, his motivation was all about money. And Burr is more about power. And so it all is based on that individual. Blunt would be about money, and land, because land is money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's about, A lot of it is, part of it is an accident over who we selected to be in the book. We did not set out to have like one angle on this. You could do, there have been books written about scoundrels who are mostly economic or financial actors, like kind of swindlers and that kind of thing. So once we ended up getting in, kind of the land and the contest over the frontier are the two things that came up most often, you know. But some of that is a selection effect.
You've talked about how lots of these individuals have held or aspired to public office, and they'll be held to account by public opinion. I was wondering if you could talk about how that public opinion was gauged or assessed at the time, what the role of the press might have been, and was influencing that public opinion part of these individuals' playbook?
Well, I mean, the press is very divided. You have a very partisan press. And so each side is picking and spinning tales about the other parties. And so some of these things are going to be put out about the Feast of Treason was definitely put out there to, put a cloud over the trial and all the corruption that's going on there, right? Or the supposed corruption. So I think a lot of it has to do with the press.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You mentioned power and you mentioned money as being motivations, but you didn't mention sex. So if we were to throw that in, couldn't Alexander Hamilton have been considered a scoundrel?
Well, yes, as we mentioned, the question that came before, right? It didn't even have to go to that, right? They thought that he was embezzling money or giving away secrets to help out his friends and things like that. I don't think that comes up really in any of the chapters as an important motivation. It just really doesn't. Right, there's Philip Nolan has these adventures in the West, and he has at least 2 different women he's involved with that he has children with, I believe, and they had the same name.
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name.
I forget. They had the same. The 2 women he's involved with had the same first name. Well, I guess makes things convenient remembering who.
Yeah.
So then he marries a respectable girl. Who's from a prominent Louisiana family, so it's like 3rd person in there. But I don't think that was his primary drive, right? His primary drive in that case was become more respectable by being able to earn a income, and then whatever he did out in the West was kind of like out there and didn't affect who he was back there. But no, I don't think that came up as a major theme or motivation for the men who are involved here.
If you don't.
About William Dorr, would he be considered a scoundrel?
Mm-hmm. I don't know enough about his story, honestly. I'll be honest. I don't know enough about his backstory, where he could, whether we'd put him in that category or not. I just don't know enough offhand.
And then I'll bring this over here.
You mentioned that part of what Aaron Burr was trying to do is sow these seeds of disunity between the East and the West. And I noticed that when we talk about from the Constitutional Convention to the American Civil War, you see a divide between the North and the South. So I know you mentioned taxes, I know you mentioned the West being harder to control, but what were the main things that were contributing to that East-West divide at the time?
So the East-West is, part of that is land speculation and then the taxes. If you look at the Whiskey Rebellion, it's about the excise tax. And so there's a partisan divide on the frontier as well. So there's a bunch of things going on in that regionalism And that's a very good question.
Yeah, I think part of it is, I mean, you're thinking about what you've learned in school and heard and things. I think part of that is simply reading the Civil War back into an earlier period, right? And, not appreciating that there are different kinds of divisions that are possible. So that shows up a lot. And, sexualism is a theme that develops in the antebellum period, but the country can be divided any number of different ways. You can do, seacoast versus the backcountry is another major division that you see. So yes, I think part of the way that gets taught is like launching us towards the Civil War rather than just being content to understand the period on its own terms.
When researching the history of these scoundrels, how is it exactly that you assign the term scoundrel to them? Like I remember the definition, but how do you assign something that they do as invirtuous? Because every politician would of course have some sort of personal goal. So how can someone's personal goal be more scoundrel worthy than someone else's?
Right. I think we're getting a lot of questions. Who counts as a scoundrel and who doesn't, right? I think that's our purpose was not to like come up with the top 10 scoundrels and right. You won't believe number 7. Less about labeling. And I think our purpose was let's explore the lives of these men, of these people, and what their lives were like, and why could they be seen as scoundrels? Scoundrels is the hook into this, but what we're really trying to do is to explore their lives and what it was like to be a figure who's not one of the classic founders, right? They're trying to take a look at this period through the eyes of, or through these characters who are not the typical founders, the Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, all those guys, but other people who are also active at the same time. How do you put together that larger story? We did not want to do another story about, here are the founders and aren't they wonderful? Here are their accomplishments. Okay. Or the flip side of that, which is really the same thing, is here are the founders and aren't they terrible? All right. They did all these things wrong. That's an old stale kind of debate, although people still like it. But it just it didn't appeal to us to do something like that. So let's look at some other characters and what their perspective was, and how their actions, this is the subtle part, how their actions were also instrumental in making the United States the country it would become. A great example of this is William Blount again. It's his land shenanigans that are essential to Tennessee becoming a state when it does. Now, maybe you could say eventually people would have moved west in that area, eventually that territory would have, but to become a state on the schedule that it did, Blount and all the swindles he pulled made that happen. So how can we hold those two ideas in our head at the same time? That someone who did these nefarious things was also instrumental to building the state. And then you can, you can decide how widely you should apply that to other figures.
We'll take one more question.
As historians, do you all find it easier to have multiple interpretations, or do you find it easier to have like one main path? So you seem to hold these sources like close to your heart. They're your little treasures. Would it be easier for you to have fewer sources so you can have a broader interpretation, or to have more sources? What do you find more appealing?
Right, I think we like to have more sources, even when they cause headaches, right? Yeah, it would be nice to have, 8 reliable sources who all confirm the idea you already had going in, right? Who back you up nicely. Say, oh, there you go. Good job, David. You got this one. But that's not real life. Isn't like that. I think we'd like to have as much material as we can, even though it causes headaches trying to interpret it when it is contradictory, or you can, the source that supports your argument the best is the hardest to confirm, right? And the source that contradicts you is the one that's obviously true. What are you going to do? I mean, it just drives you crazy. I think the key when you're doing history is to follow the sources where they go. Okay? To let them lead you. No, not like a bad GPS that leads you into the lake or something. You got to keep your senses about you. but as much as possible, let them lead you more than you saying, come on and fit into this argument I want to do. So yes, it's messy, but I think the more the better.
And you also let the sources tell the story, and that's the trick.
Great. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Let's give a big round of applause. Be sure to buy a book on your way out, and our two speakers will be up front signing books after the talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.